He was the one that persuaded the men writing the Constitution to omit from the proposed Constitution the guarantee of trial by jury and of an adversary trial. Now, this is important because it looks like Nixon's on the way out, and we'll have Gerald Ford for president. And Warren Burger and Gerald Ford were very close in Michigan. And don't forget it for a moment. The selection of Gerald Ford to succeed Richard Nixon means he works very well with the old team. So the Justice of the Supreme Court wanted in 1970 to omit trial by jury and adversary trials. And his argument was that the jury trial slows the wheels of justice and that the adversary system does the same. And he says there's no guarantee that a formal case with two opponents does not necessarily produce justice. So that the Supreme Court defines, like they define what's national security, they define what is justice, and trial by jury does not necessarily mean we have justice. So 1970 it was planned to do away with the jury. And this morning in the paper, this is June the 3rd, 1974, following on the heels of the Washington Post article, just May 26, is an article, Jury Picking System Wastes $50 Million. A survey shows, again, a CIA front tested in Texas, Michigan, Maryland. The Byrd Engineering Research Associates of Vienna, Maryland, no, this is Virginia, Vienna, Virginia, received a $157,000 grant from the LEAA, which is the CIA branch, the Armed Forces branch of the Justice Department, and came up with the conclusion that courts waste $50 million in the methods with which they select juries. Now, in lieu of the fact that today's paper also talks about a cost overrun of $26 billion in arms, $26 billion over what, not the budget what they had for arms last year, but over this year, it seems to me that if the jury system ran over $50 million to get a fair trial, the citizen should have the same rights as Mr. Roy Ash, who's making submarines and ships for the Navy with his cost overruns. There's a list here of $1.43 billion for the F-15s. If the cost of living has gone up that much, or $417 million for the SAM-D missile, or $349.9 million for the U-2 TAS helicopter, and $394 million for the XM tank. These are overruns. $189 million and $916 million for parts of an airborne warning system. If the overrun, not the original cost, is running to $26 billion, that doesn't matter. But if the jury takes $50 million to assure that certain people who are framed by provocateurs don't go to prison, they call that an extravagance. They don't equal what it would cost to keep all these people in jail for the rest of their lives or appeals. And also in today's paper, there's a dispute because the military wants $5.8 million for a new deadly gas when they already have enough to kill everyone on this earth. So it can't be the budget saving they want. And because in 1970 they wanted to do away with the trial by jury, and now the spoil sports are crying because people are getting out that the Justice Department wanted prosecuted, they find it necessary to say very openly the time will come where you can't choose the jury system that way. The excuse not being that we're racist or anything like that. The excuse will be we have to cut down the domestic budget. Now, I'm going into a subject today. We've heard so much of the SLA, but an item came up in the news this week that has been buried since March. I covered it on our program here in March when I picked it up in the Washington Post, and now it's again in the wire services in a bigger story by Doug Porter, Intelligence Report. And it's about the murder of Beverly Kay, the secretary at the White House. And they're talking about the SLA, and they're doing psychological profiles. And the Washington Post had a full page on what was on the mind of these radicals, keeping in mind, again, they only robbed $10,000 from a bank. So I'm going into the murders in the White House while we've been watching the Watergate take place to see who really is the violent person and what's going on in this country. James McCord, when he spoke to Judge Sirica, made the statement he didn't want to go to jail, and he wanted to stall it as long as possible because he said, in quotes, "I worked in law enforcement for a large number of years, and I know what can happen in terms of retaliation, whether we're speaking of physical retribution or retribution of a wide variety of forms." He told his friends and family and the Watergate Committee, "I have my will made out," because he said he could be stabbed or killed in prison because he knows too much, and people that know too much that topple the system are murdered. And that's why the people were burned in L.A., because they knew too much. So I brought a list of 20 people that have been murdered. Some we've talked about on different radio shows here, one each week as they came along. But in total, I thought I would read them, and as time allowed, go over a few of these, because the one that came in the news this week is Beverly Kay, who works for Stephen Bull in the White House and typed up and was responsible for the White House tapes. There's Beverly Kay, who was responsible for Richard Nixon's White House tapes employed by Bull, and we'll go into the details. And there's George Bell, who made up the enemies list that Charles Colson said he didn't have. It was in the hands of George Bell. Lou Russell is dead. He is the man with information that James McCord had previous relationships with Bernard Fensterwald, who heads the committee to investigate assassinations. Congressman Mills was murdered, and this has to do with the Wallace and Maryland funding, and Arthur Brammer was arrested in Maryland, if you remember that. Colonel James Wester and James Glover are two men that worked in the Wallace operation and fundraising and responsible for the $25,000 of cash that siphoned through Congressman Mills' account. Jack Cleveland, important witness, murdered in Canada, the connecting link between Donald Nixon and a payoff from Howard Hughes. Nikos Fardionians, overseas donations, Greek money. The Watergate was going into the illegal Greek donations, and Mr. Fardinonius was murdered, and that protects Mr. Tom Pappas, I'm sure, who gave much more than Nikos, but I'm sure they get the message. If one is killed, the others become silent. Like in Mrs. Dorothy Hunt, when she was killed, her plane crashed with the payoff money, the blackmail, Richard Nixon, then Mrs. McCord and James McCord and all the others get the message. James Morton, he had information of Gerald Ford and laundered money, and it may have hindered the appointment of Gerald Ford as the next president of the United States. He's dead. Dr. Gary Morris, his name was with Mrs. Dorothy Hunt when she killed. He and his wife are dead. We're going to Richard Lavoie, who was a babysitter for the ITT, took care of Dita Baird. He died last December. Murray Chotiner, his name is mentioned, regards the Milk Fund, spies of the Democratic headquarters, possibility that Alfred Baldwin turned over the tapes to him. He died. Ralph Blodgett, involved with John Mitchell, the Justice Department, and antitrust payoffs in regards to the El Paso gas. James Kruger, White House intelligence plans. He had information. Kruger and Blodgett were both working attorneys for the gas company in Indiana that had information of John Mitchell and El Paso gas. And J. Edgar Hoover, victim of the White House intelligence plans, who had to be murdered in order for those operations to go into effect. J. Clifford Dietrich of the Secret Service, killed in a helicopter outside of the compound where Richard Nixon was in the Bahamas. Mr. Taub, involved with Herbert Kalmbach, secret $2 million hush money, killed on the border of Switzerland after he was beat up. Joseph Toriendo and Arthur Rodriguez. Down in the Miami community, Cubans who would have important links between Mr. Sturgis, Bernard Barker, Richard Nixon, Bibi Rebozo, through the Miami Cuban connections, and Mrs. Andrew Topping, who had to be silenced because her husband had plans and appointment to get to the White House and kill Richard Nixon, and those were halted because of the Watergate exposures, and Mr. Topping did say that she was killed by a member of their team because she knew too much. The story will go back. These are the people that have information on the milk funds, Dita Baird, the ITT, the Justice Department, the gas deal with the Soviet Union, White House intelligence plans. You see how much these people knew. Set up the enemy list, the Wallace shooting, the relationship of McCord to an attorney in Washington, D.C. All these people were pivotal people that knew too much. Now, there was an article, the one I'm reading is by Doug Porter, on Beverly Kay, and as I say, we mentioned her in March. He used the expression termination with extreme prejudice. He had information from the federal offices that the order went out. That's used by the intelligence agencies. Tackwood uses it, refers to it in the Glass House tape. Termination with extreme prejudice means kill her, she knows too much, or kill him. It's a standard tool used by our intelligence agencies all over the world for people who are 1, troublemakers, 2, security risks, or 3, in opposition to political parties. We've used it in Greece, Chile, South Vietnam. The Central Intelligence Agency, the Phoenix program, used it on 40,000 civilians in Vietnam who died without trial. The Phoenix assassination team, the name down there now is called F6 and not the Phoenix. They changed it to the F6. The same techniques of Vietnam War are being used in the United States. Beverly Kay, in December 1973, was in the White House. She was a secretary working for Stephen Bull of the Secret Service, and her job was to keep the tape recordings of Richard Nixon. She stored and preserved these tapes in her desk. That was her task, and she would be a very important witness if ever the Senate Watergate Committee wanted to know about any erasures or 2 tapes that we heard were not recorded at all, that didn't exist. Those could have existed, and she could have known it, and then they were destroyed later. She would have known a lot about the White House tapes because the conversation with John Mitchell and John Dean, the 2 most important tapes, we were told didn't exist. When for a long time they were fighting not to reveal them. When they said we'll turn them over, then they said they never existed. Beverly's ex-husband is in the Air Force Intelligence. She lived in Virginia. She was at the White House and felt ill. The White House doctor was summoned. They took her downstairs. She collapsed and died of a massive stroke. The coroner at Allegheny County said that the death by stroke is a statistical aberration. She was in her early 40s, had never been sick before, but could have been caused by the injection of an air bubble in the bloodstream. Her funeral was paid for by the White House. Her friends and family could not see the open coffin. Stephen Bull, the Secret Service agent, refused to allow the casket to be opened. Notice was made in the article that this is not normal for a young person with no previous illness to not have the casket open, because with a stroke today and with the wonders of science, the body looks like it's sleeping, and there was no reason for the secrecy of Beverly Kay. The other man I mentioned was George Bell. The question came up June 30th. He died in 1973. The question came up at the Watergate hearings about who made up the enemy list. Was it used for Internal Revenue Services? Who selected the enemies? And Charles Colson, who is great at denial, denied every charge about him until the day copped a guilty on a minor charge, denied any involvement in the enemy list. It was described by John Dean in his testimony. George Bell, the late George Bell, was the one who kept the list, and there was an article June the 30th, 1973, that he expired. There was a longtime security cop who was employed by James McCord, worked for him for many years. He was going to work at the Republican convention. He brought a dozen checks in different amounts from James McCord to Bernard Fensterwald's committee. Bernard Fensterwald has been working on the investigation of James Earl Ray, John Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, particularly, not so much the Robert Kennedy, but he's been trying to open up the James Ray case, and he's been an attorney for James Ray on and off, and he headed in Washington the committee to investigate assassinations. A lot of people around the country are dropping away from the committee. They believe it's too infiltrated by the CIA, and a lot of the researchers question James McCord, Bernard Fensterwald, after McCord went to him for his attorney. I'm not taking sides on the issue, but when the question came up about did McCord know Bernard Fensterwald long in advance of when he was supposed to know him, the man who was bringing the checks, allegedly bringing checks back and forth from James McCord to Bernard Fensterwald, Lou Russell, and there was an article July 31st, 1973, that he's dead. This article was in the Boston Phoenix, dated May the 12th, 1973, if you want to look it up, about the relation